the fog. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about, as one of my favorite themes, the silver-tongued devil. So Indian philosopher Krishnamurti warned us about him in a story he told during a lecture in the 1970s. He said the devil and a friend of his were walking down the street, and they saw a man ahead stoop down and pick up something from the road. And as he picked it up and looked at it, he was very startled. And there was a great delight in his face. And the friend of the devil asked what it was that this man had picked up. And the devil said, "It's the truth." And the friend said, "Well, isn't that a very bad business for you then?" But the devil said, "Not at all. I'm going to help him to organize it." So it's my belief that Krishnamurti's story perfectly illustrates how politics works. Politics does not rely nearly as much on lies and fabrications as it does on the reorganization and distortion of the truth, particularly the truths that human beings long to reconnect with the most deeply. So I'm going to talk about three main aspects of distortion. First, the truths that are distorted. Secondly, how they're distorted and reorganized, by what mechanism. And thirdly, why this is important, why we should care, and in particular, why this topic is relevant to the critically minded and activists engaging in risk, strategy, sacrifice, and coping with loss of friends, networks, prospects, financial security, and also coping with fear and fatigue. These days, even having an opinion often comes with all of that, as we know. So firstly, the truths that are distorted. What truth might the devil get excited about reorganizing? So let's look at the political landscape, because there it would appear as though all human values have been organized and distributed a bit like a bag of mixed candies at a kid's birthday party. So each child gets a selection roughly equivalent in size and sweetness to the others, just so that there won't be any arguments or fighting. So the conservatives have family values alongside the notion of responsibility, which of course in a conservative worldview translates to what we call bootstraps thinking, telling people who are struggling to pick themselves up by the bootstraps. Liberalism has two values roughly equal in size, shape, and sweetness in its candy bag, because that way there won't be any arguments. Liberalism is also nothing if not a rejection of conservative values. So they speak for the individual in the place of the family, and for freedom instead of responsibility. And then the left, as in the socialist and communist anti-capitalist left, promotes the collective, specifically the combined interests of the underdog or the oppressed classes and solidarity. So let's say every piece of candy is a truth or aspect of life: the family, the individual, the collective, freedom, responsibility, solidarity. The devil, the silver-tongued devil, reorganizes each truth using a specific mechanism called identification, which can be understood best, I think, through yogic philosophy of mind. So the Sanskrit word for identification is ahamkara, which is literally translated as I maker, since identifications are how we construct a self in the world. There are two other main components of mind in the yogic system: buddhi and manas. I want to focus on ahamkara and buddhi today. Buddhi is often translated to wisdom or intellect, but to me the best word is discernment. Buddhi is your ability to effortlessly distinguish between the carrot, the knife, and your finger when you're chopping vegetables. It's discernment without judgment. Through observation, yogis discovered an interesting thing about how ahamkara, identification, and buddhi, discernment, interact. Intellect follows identification like a slave follows its master. Sadhguru, perhaps the most influential yogi alive today, explains, quote, "The way you're identified, that is the way your intellect will function. If you say, I belong to this nation, your intellect will function just to protect that identity. If you say, I belong to this religion or race or caste or creed or gender, whatever, your intellect functions accordingly, because intellect is essentially a survival process. It helps you discern between the knife, the carrot, and your finger. If you identify with something, intellect will constantly go around trying to protect that identity. Intellect is a slave of the identity that you've taken, and what is right for you or what is wrong for you, everything is dependent on how you are identified." End quote. So our identifications, ahamkara, are established by way of samskaras, moments of intense emotional shock. In a patriarchal culture, the shock happens through two main types of vulnerability. This is, in my view, the natural vulnerability of childhood that makes us all subject to cultural conditioning from infancy, and the imposed vulnerability of assault, particularly rape. Living in a rape culture teaches men masculine identification and dominance, and it teaches women that for me to be okay, he has to be okay first, or else he may be a threat. So that's how a basic pattern of male identification is established in our culture. And we don't build a world from scratch with that identification. We learn to look at the existing world through the lens of identification. So we reorganize the perceivable world. So going back to those political values, to the conservative, liberal, and leftist values of the family, the individual, the collective, terms that really just reflect aspects of life. If you add ahamkara, or identification, to each, take the idea of the family, a benign reality, mix in male identification, you end up with what political conservatives really mean when they talk about the family. They mean to advocate for the male householder. Then take the idea of the individual, add in the primary identifications of liberalism, which is the ideology that sustains capitalism, and you get the interests of the individual male entrepreneur or free marketeer who doesn't want to be limited by conservative rules and constraints. Of course, liberalism, being so welded to capitalism, cannot really promote individual freedom at all. The image most often used to convey the realities of capitalism is that of a machine that renders each of us cogs. And while subjecting us to this common condition, nevertheless alienates every individual cog. This situation is antithetical to self-actualization and to individual freedom. And while the left has always apparently cared for the needs and rights of oppressed classes, it is becoming more and more apparent today, in a world where it is leftists who constantly harass feminists and women in general for our resistance to transgender ideology, that the left's primary identification is with the male underdog, or perceived underdog. And now, of course, that it's amalgamated with liberalism and you have a liberal left, you get the identifications that result from that. So how about those two twin values of responsibility and freedom, one supposedly conservative, the other liberal? I'll turn again to yoga. So one important translation of the Yoga Sutras by Barbara Stoller Miller is subtitled The Discipline of Freedom. I really like that subtitle because I think it conveys very simply how responsibility and freedom are not even really distinct. They're actually one and the same. Let's say I'm completely and utterly free. Nobody's imposing themselves on me. Nobody's telling me what to do. The first most immediate implication is that I'm 100% accountable, responsible for my actions. Every step I take, I'm accountable for. This is why many people fear freedom. Being basically synonymous with responsibility, freedom is daunting. You cannot claim freedom without claiming responsibility. In my view, if you strip freedom and responsibility of the male identification that they acquire in the political landscape, you get yoga, which is to say the art and practice of taking each step of your life on purpose, consciously. I want to look at two more related examples of distortion from the realm of religion and spirituality. The concepts of selflessness and surrender. Two themes that recur in almost every piece of scripture you could find, and two of the silver-tongued devil's favorites. Within feminism, there's a sort of catch-22. The liberal promotion of the individual self is looked at with suspicion, but the spiritual idea of selflessness is also suspect. Caring for yourself as an individual is selfish and politically irresponsible and makes you a liberal. But trying to be selfless is a patriarchal trap. Wherever selflessness is promoted fervently in a patriarchal world, you can bet women are expected to embody it by losing not only their autonomy and sexual freedom, but also their bodies, safety, and lives to men. That's what selflessness looks like when it's been reorganized by the devil using the mechanism of male identification. But the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh summed up the validity of selflessness in one line: I am made only of non-me elements. We're each composed of earth material and a miraculous spark of consciousness that must be bigger than us, since we didn't invent it ourselves. Author Stephen Cope, one of my favorite authors, likes to illustrate self and selflessness using the story of Indra's net. The Indian god Indra lived high on Mount Meru, the sort of Indian Mount Olympus. And from there, he cast a net over the entire universe. At every intersection of the warp and woof of this net is a jewel, and that jewel represents Dharma. To act according to your Dharma is to uphold your part of the net. Dharma is how personal fulfillment and the net itself, the collective interest, overlap. How selflessness and self-actualization meet. Which leads to surrender. In a military or an activist setting, the word sounds like capitulation, like giving in. According to Stephen Cope in the Bhagavad Gita, surrender means the surrender of the small idiosyncratic self into the whole, into the net. Writing on Islam, Karen Armstrong says, the word Islam means surrender, and this is first and foremost a surrender of the ego. The ego's primary habits are wanting, controlling, trying, and fixing under the influence of societally imposed identifications. Surrender means relinquishing these habits, which does not amount to curling up in a ball on the floor. Surrender is courageous. It means accepting our place in Indra's net and allowing ourselves to take the actions that follow, that held to be taken from that position, even though, as Paulo Freire warned, those actions may threaten our social position and render us culturally unviable. The Tao Te Ching says, the master gives himself up to whatever the moment brings. He doesn't think about his actions, they flow from the core of his being. That core is the jewel in Indra's net, the whole of which informs our actions, meaning individual freedom can't be placed above common interest without becoming hollow. There is no freedom outside of Indra's net. But equally, the collective interest cannot be served by those who devalue individual freedom. The heart wants freedom, primarily freedom from the tyranny of identification. It saps energy to deny that longing. Secondly, collectives cannot operate effectively when their individual members are over-dependent on the group, using it to avoid experiencing aloneness. We're each born alone and we die alone. Life involves an element of solitude. When we avoid this solitude and fear it, using the group for cover, we'll also avoid the sort of independent critical thinking that might threaten our place in the group, and the group suffers. It becomes internally dysfunctional and toxic, full of insecurity and blaming, and what it conveys to the outside world will be politically dull, uncreative, and quote-unquote safe. In short, in the real world, the individual and group cannot be separated, just like the jewels and strands of Indra's net. The self and the whole cannot be divided. Responsibility and freedom cannot be divided. These are not values to pick and choose from, and can't really be distributed like candy between party bags at a kid's birthday, without us dividing and sabotaging ourselves. This matters because when the silver-tongued devil reorganizes the truth and speaks it, there's two obvious responses. One is to swallow his account, hook, line, and sinker, and be manipulated. The other is to recognize that the devil is speaking and so reject everything he says. He wins in both cases. In the first case, you took the truth and the devil's agenda with it. In the second case, to reject the devil's agenda, you also rejected the truth. That might satisfy him well enough. Sometimes we even define ourselves in opposition or as an exact mirror image of what our political opponents say. If I don't like liberals and postmodernists and they emphasize subjectivity, I will promote objectivity. If they say individual, I say collective. If they say freedom, I say struggle. If liberals and postmodernists look at life and see indeterminacy and impermanence, I may double down on materialism and cold facts. In reaction to an opponent, I might even make out like I'm a hard materialist, even though I know, as Leo Keith writes in Bright Green Lies, we are none of us frozen objects. In a world of silver-tongued devils, we should be careful not to reject truths or values, but instead question identifications. Who is promoting this idea of indeterminacy and impermanence, or of materialism and absolutes, of freedom or responsibility, of kindness, love, and inclusion, or of assertiveness and boundary setting, of selflessness or self, of surrender or resistance? What are their identifications? Are those apparent in the way that truth is being reorganized and then expressed? And what happens if we experiment with extracting identification from the rhetoric that we're hearing to see if what is left over simply reflects an aspect of reality that the human soul longs to reconnect with while the devil helps? In Krishnamurti's story, the man who finds truth on the road was startled and then his face lit up. That's been my experience with the truth. In a world that needs us fragmented, the process of rediscovering truth and reassembling ourselves is enlivening. And I think that despite his clever rhetoric, that is what the devil really doesn't like. He doesn't really care what that man who found something precious on the road really thinks, or what you or I really think. He just doesn't want us feeling whole, alive, ready to take our place in Indra's net and act accordingly. I think that's where the trouble really starts for him. Thank you.